Hello and welcome to the 2022 November-December Background and Topicality TA. This will be on the topic Resolved, the People's Republic of China ought to prioritize environmental protection over economic growth. So for this TA, we're first going to be defining the topic. So that essentially includes what environmental protection is and what economic growth includes. Then we'll also be looking at some background information. So Chinese economic system and China's environmental policy right now, as well as their past environmental policies. Then we'll kind of look at common arguments that you should expect that, debate usually reiterates and recycles throughout multiple topics. And then finally, we'll be going over topicality on this topic. So first, for a little bit of a topic overview. So because this topic is resolved, the Republic of China ought to prioritize something over something else, it's a comparative topic, which means that it's comparing two options and essentially saying one is more important. So the AF is saying that environmental protection is more important, and the neg is saying essentially the status quo, which seems to favor economic growth, and we'll get into that later, is more important. So whenever you have these sort of comparative topics, you always want to keep in mind that it is your burden as the AF to uphold whatever you're initially comparing, so the initial clause against the former clause in the sentence. This topic is also about the People's Republic of China and not the USA. So it's always important to frame your research in the context of China, but also frame your definitions and other sort of card-cutting agendas in the context of China as well, because the actor is the People's Republic of China. And one benefit we have of this topic is that since fiat is a very important concept in debate, and in this specific instance, it essentially means that we have a lot of power to do things that the People's Republic of China wouldn't do in creatively wording our plan text. So frame your prep around China and not the United States. This is also a really, really big topic. There's a lot to specify here, a lot of different types of environmental policies and that lead to environmental protection, as well as economic growth sort of disad links that you can make. Obviously, there's the econ disad. There's arguments to be made on the CAP-K, etc. All of which link into like a variety of different AFs that could be read. So getting into the background of the topic, let's first talk about the People's Republic of China. So this may seem like a review, but it's very important to understand the different actors and operations of the People's Republic of China, or just China. So the first key fact we'll look at is that China is the most populated country in the world. Why this matters is because obviously because there's more people, there's much more fossil fuel use, electricity use, there's many more people to provide for, provide healthcare and sustainable infrastructure for, etc. Which means that as the most populated country, China's economy is obviously very important to sustain the billions of people, the 1 billion plus people that live in the area, but also its effect on the environment is extremely significant. It's also one of the most powerful and wealthy countries in the world. That's economically and internationally in terms of their appearance and their hegemony. There's also a lot of diverse culture in China. That's probably not going to be as important for this topic, but still good to know. And additionally, the Chinese government is a unitary communist government, or sort of pseudo-communist government, in the way that they've shifted over to a more capitalistic model. If you've been in any of the varsity sessions, you will know about this because we've talked about this in our discussions of the CAP-K, but China is essentially, while founded on communist principles, uses a combination of private and government markets to sustain their economy. Finally, this means that the power is very consolidated at the top of the government, as opposed to just generally power being disseminated among like multiple actors with checks and balances. For example, the United States has a government with a somewhat system of checks and balances because you have the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive branches. So the Senate and Congress can always check back actions of the president, and the judiciary can always check back actions of the Senate and Congress. And so it works in a sort of tandemonious way that allows for government to be checked against. Whereas China has a much more centralized government with power at the top. There's less elective power because it's based on party popularity. as well as internal popularity. So essentially, people choose successors in the Chinese government, and so it's coming up on Xi's time to choose his successor soon, which is very important, obviously, in its own sense, because that'll be the next leader of China. And finally, Xi Jinping is the leader of China. He's the head of the CCP, which is the leading political party in China. So first, let's get into the definition of environmental protection. So environmental protection in the context of China is mostly led by the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, or MEE. This is essentially their version of the EPA, or Environmental Agency, as the United States would have in their bureaucracy. And so they're responsible for environmental protection specifically, as well as general environment in China. China defines environmental protection itself as protects the environment and natural resources and prevents and eliminates pollution and other hazards to the public. In the context of China, there's obviously a lot of pollution. Smog in China is known to be one of the worst, if not the worst, in the world, and they have a lot of water pollution in the Yangtze River, as well as the South China Sea, and additional just air pollution pretty much everywhere due to the fact that they have so many people, so many cars, and so many different sort of fossil fuel consuming elements. And environmental protection could refer to any specific policies and actions. So this could be like carbon taxes, Green New Deals, etc. And keep in mind that this definition is in the context of what the Chinese government defines their role of environmental protection as. So if you were debating this app as a whole res or against a whole res app, this would be kind of the way that the app might define environmental protection. As you can see, it's like pretty vague and doesn't specify sort of any action, which dishads can take advantage to, linking into specific things, or the app could also take advantage of using as like delinks from specific arguments. On China's environmental policy specifically, so China is actually a member of the Paris Climate Accord, which is uh, a, a sort of unifying contract with all countries, most countries signing on in the world, all except for I think one, that would be Saudi Arabia. And so it outlines a set of goals for countries to be able to engage in and make sure that they are able to complete. For example, by 2030, they want to have net neutral carbon emissions, which means they want to reduce their carbon emissions significantly. Whether or not they're on track to achieve this goal is a separate issue, but they are a part of the Paris Climate Accord. The other thing is that from 2016 to 2006 to 2017, sulfur dioxide levels in China reduced by 70%. And so this is just like one of many facts that you might hear, in that it's important to know these facts because it shows that China has been able to reduce their dioxide levels and benefit the environment in their own way. Um, so even though there is sort of an emphasis on environmental protection, China's environmental stance and their actions have been somewhat helpful in reducing their own emissions. They are also the largest investor, producer, and consumer of renewable energy. If you look on like most products that you own, it'll say made in China. This applies for like Tesla manufacturing, for example, or like car manufacturing, as well as like solar panel and like wind power manufacturing is all done in China, or at least a large part of it is. And so that gives them a lot of stance to be able to, one, like control the global economy from an environmental perspective in supplying these sort of manufacturing parts, but also proves that they are like a large reason as to why a lot of the rest of the world is able to have like solar panels and other things. Two specific little areas that are important to look at are the Yangtze River, which I mentioned earlier. There's lots of water pollution in there, and there's currently an issue with like over flooding in dams in the Yangtze River because of a lack of environmental protection over the area, and because of that, it's flooding cities and villages and towns and causing like thousands, if not millions, of people to relocate. The other thing is air pollution, which we also mentioned. It's notoriously bad, and these are just two really good examples that uh, are in our background research, and that would be helpful to bring up in debates. Next, we're going to be looking at China's environmental policy in the status quo right now, some specific actions. So COP26 was a UN summit that occurred, which every single country, or almost every single country, participated in. It was all the countries' world leaders attended in some fashion, and they talked about their progress in terms of the Paris Climate Accord. It was held by the UN, so a lot of it was somewhat inefficient, in execution, but still an important milestone which China took part of. The next policy is the 1+N policy of China. So this is actually a very important policy that China has reduced or implemented. And the 1+N policy framework is essentially a framework that says that their carbon emissions, so China's carbon emissions, should peak before the year 2030, and they should achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. So what this means is before 2030, their highest emissions in sort of a graph percentage on the y-axis should have been achieved, and from there it should be downhill. And then the 2060 goal is that they aren't producing any external carbon as to how much they're eliminating in but like produced by China. The other sort of big area for China's environmental policy is the Belt and Road Initiative. So the BRI, or the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, is a sort of policy outlined in the map below, and it's essentially like a framework that allows China to communicate with hundreds of other countries and establish a trade route with them, um, which is good for their economy, but horrible for the environment based on how they go about doing it and how the transport works, etc. And so we'll talk about this a little bit more, and it might be mentioned in some of the other TAs as well. But the BRI is an important area to look at because uh, it's a clash of environmental and economic policy. And so there's a lot of arguments and a lot of previous debate topics on this issue. For example, the 2019 TOC topic for public forum was on this issue. And so the Belt and Road Initiative is something that AFS may specify, for example. Um, the next three sort of things are electric vehicles, solar power, and carbon tax. Those are all policies China has either implemented or tried to implement on corporations or talked about implementing on corporations. So China actually is a leader, as we said, in manufacturing, but they also have their own electric vehicle sort of policy, which has been somewhat unsuccessful because a lot of people still use gas cars. And seeing as the population of China is in the billions, it's obviously a lot more, they have a lot bigger of an impact if even 70% of the people are using cars. So it's important to be able to monitor and negate that effect, which is what their 1+N policy is aiming on doing. So now we're just going to do a quick quiz to make sure that you guys are actually listening to the TA. So it's just, the question is, what is the oldest college/university in California? And you can Slack me the answers so that we know you watched the video. All right, next we're going to be looking at economic growth. So economic growth is basically the general growth of an economy and a country. And so there's many factors that contribute to this. This specifically can refer to policies or general actions like trading, economic legislation on the ballot, etc. So if China were to, or China's Congress were to vote on economic legislation that introduces tariffs on United States imports, that would be an economic policy, and they would be prioritizing their economic growth over environmental protections, if that makes sense. And this can still happen. So economic growth can still happen without government influence. However, if you prioritize environmental policy, there's evidence to be read that can on the neg that would say this hardens our economy, and there's also evidence to be read on the app that says as a byproduct of prioritizing environmental protection, you lead to economic growth. And so those two things are not mutually exclusive, and evidence will say they are, and evidence might say they aren't either. But it's important to keep that in mind, that you can have environmental protection and still economic growth, and because of investment in environmental protection. So an example of this would be like manufacturing electric cars, which we've talked about. If you prioritize manufacturing of electric cars, that is prioritizing environmental policies and protection, because electric cars are obviously a much better alternative than fossil fuel consuming modes of transport. And so because of that, like, you are prioritizing environmental protection, but then also investment also might lead to more jobs coming to China, which is a form of economic growth. Next, we're going to go into China's economic system. So China is, I'll read this quote here. So China has what economists call a socialist market economy, in which it's both state-owned and a private sector as well. So like we were saying earlier, it's a sort of mix of socialism and capitalism, in that there is private ownership, but there's also state ownership. And so in some ways, this is used sort of with malicious intent by the Chinese government, but it also helps them sort of monitor companies and exert a lot more authority than the United States would in a much freer market. And economic growth, essentially in the context of China, means general wealth growth in this system. So that could refer to like an increase in a citizen's income, but it could also refer to an increase in a company's market or a general market. And so if you look at the image on the right, the GDP breakdown, which is a measure of economic growth, is mostly in services and industry. And industry refers to manufacturing industries, things that say made in China, etc. And then there's also a small part on agriculture, which is also a very fossil fuel dependent uh, dependent area, but also methane producing area as well. And so those both contribute to um, a degradation of the Chinese environment. Next, we're going to go into some more specifics. So, China is the world's biggest economy, second to the United States, and that this leads us to a question of how do we measure what the biggest economy is in economic growth. So, there's a couple ways. The first is GDP, which we mentioned. That stands for Gross Domestic Product. It is a measure of the sort of values of goods that determine how rich a country is, and essentially is a country's net worth. Is another way you can think of it. There's also GDP per capita, which is just the GDP based on the population of a country. So it is the GDP of an individual. The next is PMI, or Purchasing Managers Index, and is the definition of it precisely is the index of prevailing direction of economic trends in manufacturing and services sector. And obviously, China has a lot of manufacturing and services in their economy because they manufacture so many cars and different items and just metal in general. And their services is also very large as well. But the manufacturing part is definitely more important in this topic. The last sort of third indicator of economic growth is CPI, or Consumer Price Index. And that's the price of the average market basket of a consumer good purchased by a household. So these are obviously very complicated terms. And so we're just doing a more brief introduction to them now, because chances are most judges and people don't fully understand the economics behind how to calculate economic growth. And it doesn't really matter in that economic growth is simply just like China having a stronger economy. And there's a lot of articles that will say China's economy grew by X or decreased by X percent. And so that number of plus or minus is much more important than how the calculations, how people arrived at those calculations. So here are some examples of policy in China's economic system. So Made in China 2025 is one, which was a plan announced in 2015 to upgrade and sort of rehash China's manufacturing in a lot of different areas and markets. And they did this through a lot of government assistance, which takes into account the socialist nature of their government. And this made China a major player. They took 10 key sectors and they decided to invest a lot in those sectors. Another thing is 5-year plans. So Mao and other previous leaders of China, as well as like Joseph Stalin um, and others in like Russia, for example, have implemented year plans, and like specifically 5-year plans, which are plans that aim at like very quickly using labor to increase the market and increase the economy of a country. So China has done that in the past, and it's probably unlikely that they'll do that in the future, but it's important to understand that they have happened. Another sort of economic policy would be an infrastructure policy. So Biden passed the Build Back Better plan, and then he passed another infrastructure bill. And similarly, China has passed infrastructure bills as well that aim to strengthen their like school infrastructure, as well as provide jobs, etc. And so those are all examples of economic policies. And economic policies, if you are implementing them, you're obviously prioritizing economic growth. And finally, the last policy is the BRI and the Belt and Road Initiative. So here we're going to get a lot more into the Belt and Road Initiative and what it is. So as we mentioned earlier, the Belt and Road Initiative is just on a map. It is a sort of trade route that China uses. It was used to be known as the One Belt, One Road, but now it's called the Belt and Road Initiative. And it's sort of a global infrastructure that allows the Chinese government to network with over 150 other countries, and it's definitely a centerpiece in their foreign policy in that it allows them to gain access to these smaller countries economically and through a much more direct trade such military venue, because they can literally march to these countries. And so this is definitely a centerpiece of Chinese foreign policy, but also their economic policy as well. It was based on the sort of Silk Road trade route that was established a really, really long time ago when Europe was sort of first entering Asia and colonizing it. And it's continued today because of the trade routes that were carved out during that time. in the maps that were used. Examples of this sort of infrastructure investment that the BRI looks at are like introduction of airports and just ship ports, as well as like cities investments in railroads and roads and just general sort of hardcore infrastructure and much more like visible infrastructure that allows um, trade and movement between countries to happen much easier. And so the BRI is already sort of underway, and that they've already started trading and using that route. So it's not really a question of whether or not China should engage in the BRI. It's a question of whether or not China should continue to or prioritize that in this case. So here are some common debate. Now that we've kind of got a background of what is on this topic and what to expect, here are some common sort of debate arguments that you will see on this topic. So the first one, obviously, is the econ dissent. And so we're not going to go into these too much, but I will say there's a very strong argument to be made that like if you prioritize environmental protections, then you neglect the economy, then you are allowing for economic collapse in China. I think the answer to that on the AF is twofold. I think that the AF can first say that implementing environmental protection leads to economic growth. And the second argument that we mentioned earlier is that you can still have economic growth even if you prioritize environmental protections. I think the neg responses to a lot of the turns on the reason this topic is different is because usually no linking from disads proves topicality is true. But in this case, a linked turn would also prove topicality is true because any sort of action that creates economic growth proves that it prioritizes economic growth alongside environmental protection because you're placing importance on it by like affirming that there is value in the impact. The second sort of common argument to expect is hegemony in international relations. So hegemony essentially stands for dominance. And so when you say like US hegemony or Chinese hegemony, you're saying their military dominance over an area. This is like a super common argument in debate, and also is very good to turn against critiques and other arguments. And so I think the argument here that you would see in hegemony, just to go into briefly, would be like that Chinese hegemony would increase by implementing environmental protections. There's also an argument to be that it would decrease by neglecting the economy. And so obviously it's the hedge good, hedge bad debate is its own debate in and of itself, whether US hegemony is good or if another actor's hegemony is good. And there's also, I think, a lot more exposure to international relations critiques and arguments, um, like Spanos or like nation state critiques. The other sort of arguments that you should look at are CCP legitimacy and crackdown and Xi arguments. So Xi sort of is like a arguments would be related to like the politics that said how does this impact Xi's legitimacy and Xi's reputation as a leader, and we'll go into sort of example about that when we look at some background cards. And finally, obviously, warming and climate change impacts on the AF, I think, especially for stock AFs, are super critical. Gives you a direct impact into extinction, and we should definitely prepare to see at least 2 or 3 of these, and obviously advantage counterplans that solve parts of the AF as well. So in terms of thinking of prep from a background perspective, you should look at specific environmental policies that we can tailor our AF and neg disads around. What the question of prioritization looks like. So does prioritize mean a complete prioritization, as in like completely neglect the economy and forefront environmental protection as the sole important thing that China has to look into? Or does it mean like prioritize or put over environmental protection, but that doesn't necessarily mean neglect the economy completely. Like you can still have economic policies and economic growth, but there should be a focus on environmental protection. And then that begs the question of what does that look like? Is that like a 60-40 split? How do you measure that, etc.? The last thing you should do in prep is China is the actor. So if you're looking at topicality definitions or you're looking at links and internal link arguments, make sure that it's centered around China itself and not other countries or corporations. There's also a lot to innovate in terms of impacts, like we looked at with the different sort of arguments of CCP legitimacy versus Xi's political reign versus like a hegemony argument, etc. Now let's get into topicality. So there are some key words and phrases on this topic that I think we should look at. People's Republic of China ought prioritize environmental protections over economic growth. So almost every word in this topic can be subject to topicality. I think People's Republic of China is the least likely because if we just specify the People's Republic of China as an actor, most judges will understand that that refers to China. Prioritize, as we mentioned earlier, putting X over Y. Environmental protection and economic growth both need to be defined, I think, or can be defined as different things. You can define environmental protection as sort of trying to, like we said earlier, China's definition of trying to protect like the environment, make sure no harm comes to it via pollution. But there's certainly other definitions to look out for that we'll go into. And economic growth, finally, what does that look like specifically? If you were to specify a specific policy, which I envision AFS doing, for example, like the BRI, then you would say like looking at the BRI in the context of environmental protection versus economic growth, or looking at 1+N in that, like prioritizing 1+N over economic growth. So specifying different types of policies in either environmental protection or economic growth. The semantics versus pragmatics debate, I think in semantics, the word over and prioritize are going to be the most important. And then I also think that uh, pragmatics can be specificity over vagueness, and that obviously environmental protections and economic growth are very vague and very large. So it's important to look at which specific ones, or what specific policies or what specific actions inside of those two bubbles that we want to look at. Finally, it's a comparative topic, so a standard of comparison must be met. We're looking at X over Y or X versus Y, and so if you aren't comparing, the AF can't just say we value both equally, right? Because that wouldn't be putting something over the other thing. So now we're going to look at what is topical. So any environmental policy is fair game for specificity. Think like a Green New Deal, green subsidies, electric cars, carbon taxes, etc. In terms of economic growth, different forms of economic growth, tempering inflation, trade, tariffs are all forms, things that countries do to grow their economy. So really any action to lead to an economic growth can be considered prioritizing economic growth. But then again, this depends on how you define prioritization. The most important thing is environmental policy must be put over economic growth. Someone can't say economic growth comes over environmental policy, and that's when the comparison aspect uh, comes in. However, those two things are conflated because environmental protection can lead to an economic growth. It's based solely on things like investment, etc. It's important to keep in mind that anything that benefits the economy can be seen as economic growth, but you have to make it clear that you as an app are prioritizing environmental policy. So some arguments we might see are T, economic growth. How does the AF or NEG define it? T, environmental protection. What does protecting the environment look like? And how do you define environment in and of itself? Environmental policies could be like one specific example of this. And then finally, T, prioritize. What is the extent of this prioritization? Does this mean completely neglecting economic growth or somewhat neglecting it? Okay, now we'll look at some cards. So here are some definitions of that I cut cards for. So for environmental protection, you can see that the OECD, which is a statistical organization that defines different terms, defines environmental protection as the activity to maintain environment through preventing or reducing pollution, and then they give the A through F standards of what that looks like. There's also a definition by China, which we sort of mentioned earlier, but this is in the context of China's actual constitution. And so the constitution of the PRC, which is in this, at least this article was created in 1979, states that the state must protect the environment and prevent pollution, which it has sort of failed to do, and that pollution has definitely increased a lot. Prioritize, I think the best definition is this Collins English dictionary definition, which says treat as more important than other things. And I think you can just group prioritize and over as prioritize over or separately. They'll pretty much mean the same thing as put above or put before something else. And finally, economic growth is just defined as a process by which a nation's wealth increases. You can look at GDP, PMI, and CPI as the three factors we talked about earlier that define economic growth. Some background cards. This is an example of a sort of solvency card that the AF might read as a background. So G is trying to protect environmental protections or prioritize it, but economic policies nullify the efforts. So it's showing a direct trade-off between the two and why you need to prioritize environmental protection over economic policies. I think this Maisland 21 card is pretty good at explaining why China thinks it's a top concern, but has just not been able to address it adequately and why we need to address it adequately. And then I think there's arguments to be made on specifically the BRI, like the IB22 card, which is the second card. There's also another section in the Maisland 21 card, which I think is very good at describing the sort of legitimacy arguments we made earlier about how this really hurts China's economic stability and growth in the long run, but also hurts them from a more political stance. All right, we're going to do one quiz question at the end as well, just to make sure that you guys watch the entire video. And that is, which college football team is undefeated in the Pac-12? You can just search this up. It's like Pac-12 football standings, and just have to put one of them on there because there's two. So this is the policy topic analysis for the November-December topic. I hope you learned a lot. If you have any questions, feel free to Slack me or any of the other coaches, or put a question on the November-December channel. And that is it from me.